Coming up on this week's Weird News, we have stories about dogs driving tractors, one man's mysterious stomachache, unusual 999 calls, and why fresh boxers are not always best.
And now, it's time for this week's Weird News with Daniel Bryan.
Hello and welcome to this week's Weird News, your source of weird and wonderful news from the last week on a podcast. On last week's show, we had stories about one man's bigamy and how his web of lies was unravelled by an Ice Bucket Challenge video, a medley of weird Tesco news stories, from burning down a store to a nappy-wearing man, how a man's love affair with the circus led him to buying a road-legal dodgem, and a new superhero called Kamen Rider 1 riding the streets of Japan, dressed as a grasshopper. If you missed any of these stories, listen back to our previous episode on the website, on iTunes, and the Player FM app for Android phones, or any other podcast feed you prefer. If you're a first-time listener, 1, where have you been? And 2, get catching up on our last 8 episodes. This week, there have been many major headlines around the world. Funerals for the 24 people killed in the capsizing of a migrant boat in Malta has taken place. A £1 billion payout has been approved in the US for former American football players with head injuries. And the clean-up has begun in New South Wales, Australia, after violent storms. These have been the major headlines of the week. But now it's time for the weird and wonderful news over the last week that you may have missed. Our stories today come from week 17, 2015, or, as some of you may prefer, the 20th to the 26th of April.
Story number 1.
On Twitter this week, Traffic Scotland tweeted to report a road delay. Their tweet said, #M74 North, Junction 13, road traffic collision due to dog taking control of a tractor. Nope, not joking. Farmer and police at scene. Vehicle in central reservation. #may cause tailbacks. And they were right. A dog had managed to drive a farm vehicle onto the motorway. Mr. Hamilton was out on his farm checking on his lambs in a field next to the M74 motorway. And as always, he was accompanied by his pet and friend, sheepdog Don. Don would always sit next to him in the small off-road buggy vehicle that Mr. Hamilton used to get around the farm. Leaving him in the vehicle while he checked on the lambs, the first thing Mr. Hamilton knew anything was wrong was when he turned to see the vehicle crashing through the fence at the side of the field and down the embankment to the motorway. Mr. Hamilton feared that he had not put the parking brake on properly and that he was responsible. However, it was Don moving around in the cabin that had started the descent down to the motorway. Mr. Hamilton ran after the vehicle, but had no hope in catching it. The doggy gods were in favour of little Don, however. He managed to cross the motorway without being hit by any cars. He did, however, come into contact with the central barriers, which promptly put a stop to the ordeal. Don was unfazed by the whole ordeal and unaware of the danger he put himself in. He didn't even make a bark or a whimper. The vehicle, however, was in a worse state. The windscreen was smashed and the front bumper crumpled. Police cleared the motorway and made sure both dog and owner were okay before reopening the motorway. Since the initial tweet by Traffic Scotland, they've had a few comical responses about the incident. Tony T wrote,
"Police investigating. So far, no leads."
Beverly Friend said,
"This is barking."
And finally, Michelle said,
"Will the dog have points on its licence? Was he breathalyzed? Did the police arrest him?"
Following on from this week's Weird News, episode 8 last week, we've had a comment in from Irene McCormack from Orlando, Florida, who agrees with our story on Kamen Rider 1 last week, who goes around fighting against drink drivers. She also thinks that every city should have one. In her email, she says that a close friend of hers lost her son after being hit by a drunk driver 4 years ago, and has been struggling to cope ever since. She also goes on to say that she believes punishments for these crimes are far too lenient, and her friend is struggling to feel justice has been done as the driver got such a lenient sentence. This is a terrible thing to happen, Irene, and I hope that over time your friend managed to regain a normal life, where she can remember her son for the nice times and does not hold too much bitterness for the driver. However, the more campaigning and people like the Cayman Rider 1 we can have could only be a positive thing, and hopefully stop people drinking and driving.
Story number 2.
Our second story this week is also about a farmer, but this time it's about what he did to himself. Rajpal Singh for Bathinda in India went to the doctors with a stomachache, which later resulted in him having 2 operations. But what was wrong with Rajpal? And what was causing his stomach aches? Well, if you consider that the surgeons had to remove 140 coins, 150 nails, and a handful of nuts, bolts and batteries from his stomach, you can pretty much imagine why he had a stomachache, can't you? Doctors discovered this little hoard of treasures when they did an endoscopy on the man and put a camera into his stomach. Now I can just about hear you all screaming at your speakers. How did they get there? Well, Mr. Singh swallowed them, but not by force. Rajpal said,
I used to gulp down coins and metals with a fruit juice or milk. Due to family problem, I had slipped into depression and got hooked into this weird habit.
This depression could very well have killed Rajpal, and it's not something that someone should try at home. Rajpal went on to say,
Doctor had told me those sharp needles could have punctured my intestine, and I would have eventually died.
The surgery to remove the items had to be done in 2 stages to give his stomach a chance to recover, before the rest of the items could be removed in the second operation. It took 5 doctors more than 9 hours to complete the surgery. But don't worry, Rajpal is feeling a lot better and was quoted as saying,
I feel much more relaxed now. I'm never going to do this again.
You can become part of this week's Weird News. This section of the show can be dedicated to you. Sponsor the show and we can fill this section with a tailor-made advert just for you. Reach your audience in a different way with the power of a podcast. We are open to your ideas, so get in touch at thisweeksweirdnews@gmail.com. Get on board with us now as our listeners grow and we can reach more and more subscribers together.
Story number 3.
999 is our emergency services number here in the UK. Each day they are inundated with calls about various accidents and crimes. But as well as this, they are called by a number of nuisance callers. This week, they've released the audio from a 999 call to highlight this issue and to try and get people to understand when, and more importantly, when not to call 999. The original call that came into 999 explained that someone had been hurt in a hit and run. However, the call cut out. Immediately, the nearest ambulance would have been dispatched as they trace all calls. The 999 call operator tried to call the person back to get more information and to keep the ambulance up to date with what they are about to find. When the operator called back again, this is what happened.
Hello?
Hello. We've got a dropped line from this telephone number. Do you require an ambulance?
Basically what it was, we witnessed a car hitting something and driving off, yes? When we went to close it, its neck was broke. It was a squirrel.
Right. So you witnessed a hit and run, so an ambulance is required?
No, I think he's dead now. It was like a little baby squirrel.
So you thought you'd phone 999 for a car that hit a squirrel?
Well, not now because he's dead now, isn't he?
Okay. We don't go out to squirrels, okay?
Right, so it's okay for a little squirrel to die?
Pardon? We're not the RSPCA, sir. We deal with people.
Please, can you put me through to the RSPCA then, please?
No, I can't transfer you through. You have to phone the RSPCA yourself. Okay, I'm going to get this all cancelled off. Thank you.
So yes, that's right. A man rung up 999 because a squirrel had been hit by a car. After realising this, the operator cancelled the 2 ambulances that were rushing to the scene. This is among other calls that have come to light where people have wasted the emergency services time. Others have included someone who phoned up to tell them they'd dropped their burger and it was bleeding. Someone saying, I need to go to hospital and I don't get paid until tomorrow. And another saying, my feet hurt after wearing 2 small shoes. These stories from the emergency services come out every few years as they have continued nuisance calls. The underlying message is that the time taken on these calls is preventing people in genuine emergencies from receiving the care they require. So, should there be an emergency services number for animals? Or should there be a quick connection to the RSPCA, like the man was after? Or do you think this man should have been reported and given a fine for wasting time and resources? Get in touch with your views. We've also had a comment in on email. However, this person wishes to remain anonymous. The reason for this is they're a current employee of Tesco, and have written in regarding our second story last week. That was a weird medley of Tesco stories that happened to crop up in the same week. This person writes in to say that he found the story really funny, and that he would love to set fire to his store sometimes with the complaints he gets from customers. He goes on to say that people come into the store in all number of weird costumes. He says there's a growing number of people that think it's acceptable to come into the store wearing onesies. He says, "It looks ridiculous and slobby. They are meant to be worn at home and not in public." Well, Mr. Anonymous, I would not recommend burning down your store, as it didn't end very well for our man last week. But I can understand you do get those days at work where these thoughts do run through your head. However, I do agree that onesies shouldn't be worn out in public, and people do look stupid in them. They're not very flattering.
Story number 4.
Kurt Almond is 26 and had a weird addiction, but not to swallowing coins this time, luckily for his stomach. He was in a relationship, and when his partner stayed over one time, they wore the same pair of underwear for 3 days running. Kurt found this disgusting, as I'm sure you can understand. For Kurt, this spelt the end of their relationship, and they promptly broke up. Kurt had to move out and move back home with his parents. So disgusted by this, and having a bit of extra cash for not having to pay as much rent, he decided to buy himself some fresh, brand new underwear. But he didn't stop there. He decided to wear a new pair every day, every week, of every month. It got to the point where Kirk was spending an average of £40 a week on underwear, as he was going for designer brands. His bank balance, however, soon suffered, and he had to downgrade to the budget brands. However, this was still too much, and after getting his insurance renewal through, he decided it was either his insurance or new boxers. Coming to the rationalisation, he realised he couldn't pick the boxers and decided he had to kick this habit. Kurt said,
"For the first time this year, I mustered up the courage and put a pair of boxes in the wash.
Kurt has managed to put this weird habit behind him now.
It felt really strange. You can't beat the feeling of a new pair of boxes. The ones that I washed felt worn and stretched.
Now Kurt washes and re-wears the same underwear again, but admits that he does occasionally treat himself to some new ones, but only when his bank balance allows. And there we have it, this week's 4 news stories. I hope you like them enough to get in touch like Irene and Mr. Anonymous did this week, and we will share your views next week. You can do this by emailing
thisweeksweirdnews@gmail.com.
or comment on our social media pages.
Comment on Facebook at facebook.com/thisweeksweirdnews or on Twitter @weeksweirdnews.
Or you can go to our website at
www.thisweeksweirdnews.com.
Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week for more weird news to wet your whistle in episode 10.
Join us next time for more weird and wonderful news from around the world. Only on This Week's Weird News. Goodbye.